You don't know how great I am. You don't know how great I am. I am what I am, and I am free. You don't know how great I am.
Yo, check this. I might not be what you want me to be, so you might not see what you want to see. But if you got a minute, listen to what I gotta say, cause it's a brand new year and it's a brand new day. See, there's a gap between my culture and the life that I lead, so some will call me an apple, and some a bad seed. They have no idea how my heart will bleed. Their words and attitudes are things I just don't need.
You don't know how great I am. I am what I am, and I am free.
You see, I'm proud of who I am, and I'm proud of where I'm from. Those ones spreading racism, they're just fucking dumb. Now if you're looking at my life, and you say I've assimilated, to simplify things, just a little more complicated. See, I'm a modern day native, with a modern day life. I have modern day problems, and modern day strife. Now I hear other natives, they talk about the past, and will I do the same? Fuck that. See, I've got no time to dwell on what's already done. I've got too many things that I want to do. And they don't include knives, and they don't include guns. I'm talking about knowledge and sharing it too. See, my people need to learn how to cohabitate, get rid of the anger, and get rid of the hate. We gotta stop for a minute and learn to educate. And you'll see in the end, we all have to communicate. I know there'll be a time to make a stand and a time to fight, but if you do that, make sure the cause is right. Because if the cause is right and the cause is just, greater numbers of people will be backing you up. History has repeatedly shown to us all that united we stand and divided we fall. They were talking about natives and natives alone, because this is a big world and this world is our home. Now I've seen some beautiful people and ugly ones too, and there's no single color that comes into view. So the message I'm sending, it's not all that long. It's just, I want the human race to be stronger than strong. I said I just want the human race to be stronger than strong.
You all have to be strong.
Done it. Word.
We all have to be strong. Peace.
Sioli swagwag, Galahindi Neo gets, Wagisli Wagi Niwakitoloda, Unidag Ngwe Winege, Ani Bojo Danse, Okinapi. Now, for those of you who are new or don't know what I just said, I always introduce myself in my colonial language. So, my name is Galahindi. So hello, Sigoli Swag, hello everyone. Galahindi Neo gets, Wagisli Wagidi Wakitoloda means, hello, Galahindi is my name. I'm a member of the people of the Standing Stone First Nations of the Thames here on Turtle Island. We are on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Huron, and Delaware nations. And we are located in what is called southwestern Ontario. And we are in the northern part of Turtle Island that's been segregated and relabeled Canada. And I just want to say, y'all go to everyone who is here today, and thank you for that. So today or tonight, it's a little bit of a pop-up stream here because I didn't really have this planned, But I did get a reminder today that there's a discussion on the history of the 60 scoop. Now, for those of you who don't know what the 60 scoop is, during the 60s, there was a campaign that was really pushed to go out and grab indigenous children and put them into residential schools. Excuse me, they could be either full time or they could be day schools. But essentially, what it meant that the purpose behind the campaign was to take the culture away from indigenous children and force them to assimilate into the colonial society or the um, civilized society, as they would say. And Faustin Oregon, Yonko, welcome in. Nice to see you here. Anyone who is not following Faustin Oregon, and you should do so. Faustin plays organ in a church and does all kinds of different stuff. I've heard some classical music there. I've heard some Star Wars covers, and so quite a wide variety of songs. And if you make some suggestions in her Discord, then Faustin will likely learn some songs if you're so inclined to do it. Um, Sherman Alexie, yes. He's done some fun books. In fact, one of his books, at least one of his books, have been made into a movie as well. And I'm just trying to remember the name of it. So right now, what we're doing is I'm waiting for the organizers to open up the Zoom meeting here for us to all get involved. And so what's happening with the Zoom meeting is they're going to have a speaker who's going to come on and talk about the history of the 60s scoop. And so part of what was happening in the 60s was children, if you were out, indigenous children were out on playing on the reservation and they were anywhere outside, the authorities would come up and grab the kids and take them into residential schools. So residential schools primary goal right from the time that was it MacDonald became our first prime minister in Canada. Um, he assigned a guy by the name of Duncan Campbell to the Ministry of Indian Affairs. And Duncan Campbell is primary job was to assimilate the indigenous people of Turtle Island into the civilized society. So what that ultimately would end up doing is that they would know very little, if anything, about their ancestry and their land rights. So if they assimilated into the civilized society, they wouldn't um, they wouldn't fight for uh, the water rights and the land rights that you're seeing happen today. And so that's kind of where we're at. And so we want to ensure that that didn't happen because there were elders who held on to those teachings and held on to the ceremonies and the language. And so, the children who survived residential schools and went back to the reserves after when they were 16 um, would ultimately be able to eventually learn their language. The problem with the children that went to these residential schools, oh, are they starting up here? Looks like it.
So I'll do the first part and then you'll do the question and answers in the end?
Absolutely, whatever you want.
So I will
Okay,
get
sounds
my
good.
screen off here.
Well, we've got quite a crowd tonight. Nice.
Hey, Kat. Oh, no. Cheddar's here. He's always trying to get into the act. That's my cat. And so I thought I thought my background looked so boring. I went and got this poster from Birth of a Family film. And I thought I'd just prop it up here. I don't know if you can actually see it, but Cheddar, it's new on the scene. So Cheddar's got to investigate. And if it falls over, we'll know that was him.
Yeah, I don't know if you've seen that cartoon that was out a couple of years ago, and it was how to prepare for a Zoom call. And on you see the guy sitting with his back, and he's looking at his laptop, and on the wall is this cat, and it's duct taped to the wall.
That's a really good idea. I hadn't heard of that.
Hard on the fur.
Well, you're going to have competition. If it's not treated as dogs, it's now your cat.
Well,
My
like
dogs
right
are
now he's just racing around the room. I don't know.
So welcome everyone. We're going to give folks a bit more time to come pop by, but thank you all for joining tonight's session on the 60 Scoop that the Indigenous New Democrats of Saskatchewan are putting on. So we'll just wait a bit for folks to come in, and there's a bit of tighter security tonight than there often is on Zoom meetings, just to not have racists hop on the meeting, which I hope everyone here is here with good intentions and do this a good way, because this is a very important topic and we're really lucky to have our speaker that we have today. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes for folks to hop on. But once again, my name is Tree Donaldson. I'm the president of the Indigenous New Democrats of Saskatchewan. I am really excited to be moderating tonight with Robert Doucette. Indigenous New Democrats of Saskatchewan are a wing of the party that does advocacy for Indigenous issues, as well as working to engage more in Indigenous people, both in the electoral process, but also the NDP, and making sure that we're pushing for issues as a party that pushing to resolve some of the many issues Indigenous folks are facing in Saskatchewan. Our session tonight is about 1 hour in length. Our speaker will talk for as long as she wants, and then invite questions from everyone, which we'll be doing in the chat. So you can send your questions directly to Robert. And then what else do I have on here? We will be recording the session to be replayed on the NDP site. We're hoping this can be kind of a learning archive folks can go to. And
recording in progress.
Oh, there we go. And I just want to thank the folks at Saskatoon Metro for helping us out by hosting the session, especially Robert Clipperton, Graham Coulter, and Cheryl Loatman, who have been doing a lot of work behind the scenes supporting this. And once again, this is part of the Indigenous New Democrats of Saskatchewan speaker series. This is our third talk. And so tonight I'm very excited to welcome Betty Ann Adams. She's a writer and award-winning journalist, a member of Fond du Lac Denizli Nation, an intergenerational survivor of Canadians' Indian residential school system, and a child of the 60s Scoop. She co-wrote with director Tasha Hubbard the 2017 Film Board of Canada documentary, Birth of a Family, and is executive producer of Everything is Connected, a film about the links between the 60 Scoops, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. She is a member of the 60 Scoop Indigenous Society of Saskatchewan. She won the 2018 Canadian Association of Journalists Award for Outstanding Journalism for her long text form for her feature Scooped: How I Lost My Mother, Found My Family, and Recovered My Identity. She was a staff reporter with the Saskatoon Star Phoenix for 29 years and associate editor at Eagle Feather News. She was reported recently on the recently released Spotify Gimlet podcast, Stolen: Surviving St. Michael's. And I'm very excited to welcome Betty Ann. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. It's good to be here. I guess I'll just jump right in. So I don't know if any of you had seen that documentary or read that piece, and if you did, then you'll think you'll already be familiar with some of the things that I wanted to cover off today. But I'll just tell you a little bit about myself as a 60 Scoop person. Fond du Lac is the northernmost community in Saskatchewan. It's fly-in community. Nowadays, you can go up there by vehicle. And in the winter, there's an ice road across the lake, but it's pretty hard to get to. And so it was very a very strong Dene community where the language was spoken exclusively as late as the 1990s. Things have changed a lot with the internet and everything else, but so I was born in 1959 in Uranium City. That's, you may be familiar with it. It was a little town up there on the north shore of Lake Athabasca. And so my story, you know, my 60s scoop story begins before me, of course. It begins with, you know, I mean, with residential schools, you know, and it begins before that with colonization. But if we think about residential schools, just very quickly, my mother attended Holy Angels Mission, which is in Fort Chipewyan, Alberta, and it's the you know, the closest one to where she lived. In the winter when she was a small child, one winter there was some kind of an illness that went through the reserve, and her mother and two of her siblings died and were all buried that winter, and that left my grandfather Ben Adam with 4 small children, and he went on the trap line and took his son that winter, and the girls stayed with a widow, but the girls were taken to the residential school. And when my grandfather got home, he got word that his youngest daughter was very ill. And so he and some men went in boats across the lake. It's a long drive across the lake. It's many hours. And they went and got the girls, and Alice was the youngest, and she was only 5, and she died on the way home from the residential school. So, you know, when we hear about the children, the numbers of children that the TRC reported, they knew of I think they had the names of 3,200 children who died in the residential schools, and either died at the schools or shortly after leaving the schools, because it wasn't that uncommon for children to be sent home when they were dying, unfortunately. And so my aunt is among those people. And so my mother's sister returned to the reserve, and she married a man from Black Lake, the nearby reserve, and my mother never returned to the reserve. And I've always, I always wondered about that, and she didn't talk much about it, but we know that the residential schools taught the children to be ashamed of who they were as Indigenous people, and made it clear that, white is right. And if you can be white and be in the white world, that's what you want. That was what people were trained to believe. And my mother never did go back to the residential school. So she was living with her father at Uranium City. He was working in Uranium City after she got out of the residential school when she was a young woman. And that was where she met my father, who was among a group of Irish and British workers who had come to Uranium City to work. And so I was born in 1959. I was my mother's first child. She was unwed. My father left before I was born. He went to Edmonton and didn't come back. And then a couple years later, my sister Esther was born, and I didn't remember Esther, but she was taken when she was just an infant. She was scooped, and I stayed with my mother until I was 3 years old. So it was in 1962 that I was living with my mother in Uranium City. And I remember the day. It's one of those memories that sticks with you. I remember that day that I was wearing a little dress. It was like kind of too small for me. I just remember that feeling of being constricted, and there were some people, grown-ups in the room that I didn't know, and they were being really nice to me. Like, they were paying attention to me and being nice to me. And my mother was crying. She was sitting, and I remember that I was sort of standing between her legs as she was sitting, and she was clinging to me and crying. And they literally pried me out of her arms and took me with them. And I remember that we were in a car and it was a hot day. It was June. And I remember that they sat me on the seat and the hot cloth seat was burning my legs. And the woman there, because there was a woman and a man, and I've always thought that it was a police officer, but it's kind of hard to say for sure at this point. But there was a man driving, and the woman held me on her lap. She was the passenger, and she held me on her lap. And then I remember being in an airplane, and looking down and seeing like the teeny tiny the little vehicles, and being told what I was looking at, and then I remember driving up to this farmhouse, and this woman came out wearing an apron, and that was it. That from the morning until the night, I went from the northern part of Saskatchewan to just east of Prince Albert, and my life was started over. And now I was I was told, this is my mom, this is your dad, and they had 3 children of their own. And at that time, I was bilingual. I could speak, I could understand English, but I didn't hear my language again until I was an adult. So, I remember the the transition period being difficult. I remember crying a lot and having tantrums, and that just wasn't allowed. There was no kind of sympathy for it. I was being bad if when I was expressing those emotions. And I have great respect for my foster parents who took me in, and they had good intentions, but they were ordinary Saskatchewan people, and they didn't know how racist they were. They didn't realize how racist they were. They didn't have there was no compunction about saying really negative things about Indigenous people. It was just sort of understood that what they were saying was factual, and no one ever questioned them on it, and they weren't the only ones. That was generally how people were. I remember one time coming out of church in Prince Albert, and my mom talking to somebody on the door, on the church steps, like you do after church, and I remember them saying that it was a beautiful Indian summer day, and my mom saying, at least the Indians are good for something, and they both laughed. And so those are the kinds of remarks, the offhand comments that I grew up with. If our family went for a drive and we were on a highway that drove through a reserve, there would always be commentary about that, about look at these houses, look how run down they are. These people don't care about anything, they don't care about stuff. They don't care, they're lazy. And all of the worst stereotypes, they were just part of regular life growing up. And when we moved into Prince Albert when I was about 10, and so I went to a Catholic school. There was nuns for teachers. Not all the teachers were nuns, but just some of them. And then I remember we were learning about Indigenous people, and so I was happy that we were doing that, because I was going to get to learn more about my people, and I was very proud to say that I was Chipewyan, which was how my foster mom had always pronounced the name of my people. And a few days into working on this project, one of my white classmates said to me, "You're saying it wrong. It's Chipewyan." And it was humiliating and embarrassing. And it was like, I'm a phony. I'm not really like I know I'm always told I'm an Indian. I'm not white. I can't be white, but I'm not really, like I'm I'm phony if I say I'm an Indian, because I don't even know how to say the name of the people I come from. When I was in grade 8, I was in the library looking for information about Indigenous people. And the only thing, like any books that you found were published in the United States in those days, like you couldn't even find a book in the library. I found a pamphlet with Indians from Canada, and there was like half a page in this pamphlet about the Chipewyan, and they said that the people were fierce and war loving, and when their people were old, too sick or frail to travel, they were just abandoned and left to die. And it was just horrifying to read that. And I don't want anything to do with those people. But I was 14 at that time, and that those questions about who are you, remained. And like I had been taught to be afraid of Indigenous people, and I was, and so as years go by and you're a teenager and stuff, you meet people. And of course, in my school, there were other kids who were Indigenous who I know now were Métis, and some were First Nations, but that was something we never ever talked about. Like among the kids, like if I was with Indigenous kids, it was never ever talked about. And I don't know if they were also keeping their heads down, so to speak, about being Indigenous, or if it was that I was such an apple at that time that they didn't bother to include me in things. I don't know, but I definitely felt completely separate from Indigenous people. I remember feeling like awkward if I was with I'd gone to one school where there were kids from the reserve, and when I was among the kids from the reserve, I always felt awkward, and I felt I felt out of place. And I had been so completely grown up with these beliefs that I had a sense that it was best to just fit in, to be as white as I can, because the other side is completely unknown, and it's dangerous, and I'm lucky. I'm lucky. And just as people have told me all my life that I was so lucky that I was being raised in this white family. And it took me many years to even question that, and so, all my friends were non-Indigenous. And so, right up until my early adulthood. So I trained as a dental assistant. One of my instructors is here tonight, Sheila Whalen, and it's so great to hear your voice tonight. And there were, I know now that there were some other Indigenous people in that class of students, but at the time I didn't know it. I know now who they are, but at that time I didn't know that they were. Once again, it was one of these things of just kind of keeping your head down. And there was a dentist in Uranium City whose niece was in the class, and she was going there for her week of field training. And so when I heard about that, I asked if I could go up there too, and the dentist was okay with it, and I was able to go. And I went there because I knew that that's where I was born. I'd seen my baptism certificate, and I knew that was where I was born and where I had lived when I was a little child. And so I went there, and the dentist, in those days before the days of privacy laws, the dentist just had these binders full of the health card information, right? Like the names and birth dates of the parents with the kids and all of their birth dates. And sure enough, she was able to find for Fond du Lac, which, was among her clientele there, she was able to find my mother's name and my name and the names of 3 siblings. I was completely shocked. I had no idea. I knew by that time that I had a sister that I'd gotten to meet once. Our social workers had arranged it. But otherwise, this was complete news to me. And so the dentist wrote down the names of, the names with the birth dates. And she gave me this little slip of paper, and I still have it. But when I saw it, I was 19 years old, and I thought, wow, I had this vision of this family. And then I knew I wanted to meet them. And then there was just this intention. I'm going to find these people. And I didn't know that it would take about 45 years to find them all. And, after that, like by then that journey began at that point, really. And I knew I had relations up there, and I met a man traveling on the bus to Edmonton. I met a guy from Fond du Lac, and he was, and you talk, and he was like, well, who's your family? And I explained my situation, and he was like, I can help, I can find out who your family is. And so sure enough, a couple of weeks later, I get this phone call, and it's this guy, and he says, here's somebody who wants to talk to you. And I answer the phone. It's like, hi, cousin. And it's Archie. It's me, your cousin, Archie Robillard. And you might recognize the name Archie Robillard. He was the chief of Black Lake, and he died from COVID in 2021. He was the first of my relations. And he told me, he said on the phone, cousin, we're so glad to know that you're there. He said, we never forgot you. Our mother always talked about you. And she would, she and our grandfather, they wondered where you were. And they always talked about you, and I was completely overwhelmed because I had no idea. In all of those years of my life, I had felt completely disconnected. It was as though I had been born on the day that I arrived at that farm. I had no connection of any sort to my people. And here I find that there is a family that claims me. Hi, Cheddar, that claims me and who remembered me and wondered where I was. And it was years later when I ordered up my files, my social work files. And do you know, I found in there that when I was about 11 years old, there was a note in my file the social worker had that my grandfather had somehow gone through all the channels and had tracked me down to Prince Albert and got so far as getting to speak to my social worker. And you have to consider that, you have to remember that in the 1960s, at that point, in the 1960s, no internet. The only telephone, do you remember how it was in the North before phones were available? And you're the NDP, so you know about this. You know what it took to get telephones into the North, because the long distance calls were so expensive that if anyone got a phone, everybody came to their house and asked to borrow it, and they all made long distance phone calls because it was this precious resource to make a long distance phone call. And the person who had the misfortune of having the phone was stuck with this massive phone bill, and their phone would get disconnected because they couldn't afford to pay this big phone bill for the whole community calling their relations. And so in that environment, my grandfather somehow tracked me down. Was it like, how many letters did his children have to write on his behalf? And how many expensive long distance phone calls did it take for him to track me down when I was a permanent ward? I mean, I was among that group of kids who had been stamped, you're ours, like you never go back to your mother. You never go back. And all four of us were stamped permanent wards, except for the two who, well, then they got adopted. But my grandfather tracked me down. And in the notes, it said they told him, and I suspect that they asked my mother. And they said, she's taking figure skating lessons. She's very happy. It would just confuse her. And I didn't know that. And of course, I did get to meet my grandfather before he died, but I didn't know at that time that he had tracked me down. And so I was never able to talk to him about that. And it was years later that I discovered that that he had found me, and if I'd gotten to talk to him, it would have been completely different for me to know that I had people who wanted me. And I was lucky my home was safe. There wasn't any particular emphasis on education or anything in the family I grew up in. So I wasn't a great high school student. And I don't know. I guess I just feel as though I was lucky. I grew up in a stable home. I did get some post-secondary training. I did have, I was able to I had a good work ethic. We were definitely taught to work hard. Um, and also I had that really instilled sense that I needed to put a lie to the stereotype. I couldn't be the drunk Indian. I couldn't be, the stereotypes. I couldn't be that. So there was a lot of constraints. I felt that I needed to conform and succeed to prove that I was a good Indian. And you grow up with these beliefs, and then it takes a long time to get beyond it. By the time I found my family, I had gone to university. I never did graduate, but I went to university taking various courses for years and years. And I met a lot of students. I met an Indigenous woman in the cafeteria, and she was just really persistently friendly. Whenever she'd see me, she'd come and talk to me, and she invited me to come and sit at the table with the Indigenous students. And she said, I'd noticed that table of Indigenous students over there in the corner, and of the buffeteria in the arts building, right? You guys probably remember it. And but she said that I've noticed you, all year, and people have said, well, hey, there's that, invite her to come sit with us. Because at that time I'd stopped, my mom had always given me residential school haircuts when I was little. And but as soon as I was 13, she told me, okay, you can do whatever you want with your hair. And I didn't cut it again until I was almost 30. So I had hair down past my waist. And so I was clearly, visually identifiable as Indigenous. And so they, the Indigenous students were saying, well, you should invite her to come sit with us. And someone said, oh, no, she always sits with the white people. And and this Mary Jabot was the name of this woman. She's from Fort Chip, and she and I became friends. And she was the one who told me, you need to go, by this point, it had been several years since I had first connected with my cousins. And they had kept saying, you have to come to the reserve. Our grandfather wants to see you. And whenever they'd come to Saskatoon, I'd get to meet all of them. But I was just so afraid to go. And it was Mary who said, you need to go and see your grandfather before it's too late. And so I did. And I'm so glad that I did, because he died 3 months after I met him. And it was a really, it was a great gift to me to meet him. And it was really part of getting to know who I was. And I've been on a journey ever since, getting to know who I am as an Indigenous person. And in my work at the Star Phoenix, I had, being a journalist is a wonderful career. It gives you opportunity to meet people from the entire spectrum of society. And you can ask people personal questions, and you can learn about their lives. And I was able to meet a lot of Indigenous people, and I found that people were just always very welcoming. And if you had a question, and if you had the humility to ask with some humility, people were always happy to teach. And for a long time, I felt like there was the circle of the Indigenous people, and I was on the outside of that circle. And I was outside that circle, and I was inside a bubble of white protection. And it took many years for, invitations to join the circle and taking tentative steps into it. But ultimately, it was when it took me many, many years. I met my mother. I was fortunate to have a relationship with her for 15 years. She was living in Vancouver's downtown east side, but she had a stable living arrangement, and she had a wonderful partner that she'd been with for a long time, and she and I had a good relationship. I will say that one year there was a journalism conference in Vancouver in May, and it happened that it was over the Mother's Day weekend. So I, arranged to get the handy van because she used a wheelchair, and we took the handy van from her apartment down to the beach, and we had a wonderful day on Mother's Day. And, I brought her gifts, and we had lunch in a nice restaurant and stuff. And I realized later that although she had given birth to 4 children, it was the only Mother's Day in her life that she was celebrated by one of her children. And I often wonder how many residential school survivors were denied family life as children, and then, because of the 60s scoop, had their children seized from their arms and never got to be mothers. My mother missed out on family life as a child, and she missed out on the experience of being a mother. When we made this film, Everything is Connected, about the connection between the 60s scoop and missing and murdered Indigenous women. One of the people who spoke to us talked about his mother and how she came home from residential school pregnant. She was a young teenager. She gave birth to the child. The child was immediately scooped. That was Gary. And she ran away, but she was flagged. And she had children in 3 other provinces, and every one of those children was scooped at birth. And they only found that years later as the adult children found each other. But at the reserve, no one knew what had become of her because she never reconnected with her family at the reserve. They found out ultimately, the brothers did a DNA thing. They found brothers in Georgia. She left Canada and married a man in the United States, where she was able to give birth to and raise her own children. She had to leave Canada to be a mother. So I see we're at 7:30 here, and I know that we had planned to have 30 minutes of Q&A. And I can keep talking, but certainly if anybody has questions, I'm certainly willing to answer them. It's some of the topics that if I had time, I would. I've already mentioned the connection to residential schools. An important thing to remember is that the TRC found that the residential schools were committed cultural genocide, and absolutely the 60s scoop was the next generation of the residential schools. It was the next iteration of Canada's ongoing project of assimilation and cultural genocide. And I will just explain why that is true, and my family proves it. You have to consider that all 4 so Mary Jane was a status Indian, and her children, we all got 6-1 status because she deliberately didn't put our father's names on the birth certificates. And as such, the way it was in those days, they allowed us, then all of us kids were 6.1 status Indians. But we were all raised in white homes. And guess who our partners are? We all had children with white people. And so our children are 6.2 status Indians. Well, guess what? They were raised in white context. And so all of Mary Jane's grandchildren, my mother, all of her grandchildren, their partners are non-Indigenous. And so my grandchildren, if I should have any, there's, my daughter isn't married. There's still, some chance that she might actually, she could have a child with a status person who has a 6.2 status or 6.1, and then her children would be 6.1 and be full Indians again. But the chances are pretty strong in favor that none of Mary Jane Addams' children will be status Indians. Congratulations, Canada. You wanted to have every Canadian absorbed into the body politic. You don't want to have treaty partners anymore. Let's assimilate them all until they don't exist. Well, congratulations. It worked in our family. Cultural genocide and absolute disregard. And, according to UNDRIP, this is exactly the kind of protection, the kind of violation against our people that UNDRIP attempts to stop and to protect the people from. So that's assimilation. And I've said cultural genocide, because of course, as I said, I spoke the language when I was a small child, but I didn't understand it by the time I heard it again. And I don't even aspire to learn the language because it's too hard, frankly, and I don't have the determination to do it. And you don't accidentally learn a language, an Indigenous language. And while it was the language everyone at the reserve spoke when I went there in 1986, now there are small children who are growing up there who don't speak the language anymore. The internet and access to all other communications has really eroded the strength of the language. So I'm just, I guess, like Tria, or Robert, or I trust that you'll break in if and when there's a question, and you can ask me. If there isn't, otherwise I'll just keep babbling.
I want to just say thank you to you, because I was welling up thinking about what you went through, and you're a brave, strong person, sister, and I want to thank you for sharing that story, because even mine, you're lucky I didn't get to meet my grandfather, and I can't really talk about it or I'll start crying, but I just want to thank you. And if there are other things, I do have some questions myself, but there is one from Tria Donaldson. And it's up to you if you want to speak a little bit more, because I know that, just by way of example, my question was, can you speak about, I'll bring Tria's question up first, and I wanted to ask you something I wanted you to expand on something. So the question is, can you speak about the child and welfare system today, and how is it still, what's happening with respect to Indigenous people in a child welfare system today?
Yeah, well, I can't speak with complete authority, but I can certainly give you some, so first off, right now, we know that the vast majority of children who are in foster care, I say foster homes. I'm just going to make this point that we hear this term in care and foster care, and I don't like that term, because that's suggesting that we weren't being cared for when we were with our families. And we know in many cases that it's not quite as simple as that. It's not that the parents don't care for their kids or that they aren't taking care of them. Often we're talking about poverty. And we're also absolutely talking about the intergenerational effects of the residential school, of the trauma. We're talking about parents who are still living the trauma of their own childhoods, having been raised by children who grew up with trauma and who were raised by children who grew up in trauma. We're talking about generations and generations of trauma. And when we see parents who are struggling to take care of their children, struggling to manage addictions, we know that what's really needed is for intensive therapy. We know that free therapy should be available to all Indigenous people all the time, without limitations. Right now, there are certain programs that allow therapy, but it's limited. And if you go that route, you're going to get to know someone, get to trust them, tell them your life story, and after your hours are done, either you start paying them or you're done. Or maybe you can find some other program, but you're not going to get that same therapist. you're gonna have to start from. Anyway, the point is lots of trauma. So lots of Indigenous children in foster care. I believe we're at something like 80% in Saskatchewan of children who are in the child welfare system are Indigenous. We know that there are, of course, there have been great efforts made over previous decades to stop making children permanent wards, rubber stamping it right away. And now there are absolutely efforts to keep children with their families. But we know that also can lead to a revolving door. And what the answer is beyond me. There's other people who can better answer what the answer is. But revolving door where a child goes into foster home to be safe from a domestic situation. They might be there, they're getting used to it, and then the parents go through the hoops and meet the requirements to get the child back, and then things fall apart again, and the child goes into care. And it is care, no doubt, but chances are they're not going to go back to the same foster home because that home is full of other kids now. And so every time they go through that family cycle, the kid doesn't get to go back to that same place where they can build a stable relationship and have two families, which would kind of be ideal, like if there was a safe other family that they could always go to. And, ideally, if it was someone in your family. So we know that still happens. We know that more and more, of course, in First Nations are working to take child welfare and child protection into their own jurisdictions. And we know the law has changed, or there have been, I'm not sure if it's legislation that's changed that, to facilitate that for First Nations to take control of child welfare. But that is not going to be a simple task because we're talking about capacity, human resources capacity of First Nations to take on that massive role. And we know that when First Nations took control of education, of course, that was a good thing, but the provincial government funded it at 60%, or the federal government funded the Indigenous schools at 60 cents on the dollar to what provincial schools were getting paid, right? And so the only way that child welfare is going to be adequately served and delivered by Indigenous communities is if it is funded adequately. Indigenous people know what needs to be done, but they need the money and the support to do that. And that means slow transitions while a community is developing the human resources to handle it, because you can't just all of a sudden have complete control of child welfare and now start looking to hire people. It takes, it's going to take you 10 years to develop enough local kids who graduate and go to university and maybe get some experience and training in how things work before being, put in that position. And this is sort of, a lot of this is sort of my interpretation and my view of it. And I mean, there may very well be social workers and people with a lot more experience and knowledge of those systems than I have, but that's what I have for that.
Okay, just to add to that, just quickly, because Graham's got his hand up. We were told by Premier Moe that the birth alerts had stopped and they were going to stop taking kids from the hospitals. They have not done it. They are still doing it. And as a matter of fact, my daughter and 3 or 4 other Indigenous people actually stood in front of the door at the Royal University Hospital in front of 2 social workers. Well, I won't tell you what they said, but they told them expletive deleted to get lost. And Bobby Cameron phoned the minister, and I phoned the director of social services, and they relented. But the birth alerts are still happening. They're still apprehending Indigenous kids from the hospitals. Most of the women that go missing, murdered, Indigenous women that go missing or murdered, and this was told me by an advocate of MMIWG, come from the foster care system. They do. And, it's still going on. And I've got a few other things, but Graham, go ahead. This isn't my show.
So, well, Robert, it is. I just somebody messaged me a question. So I thought I would ask that on their behalf. They were wondering about how this kind of idea of blood quantum and like percentage is often applied to the way the Canadian state actually recognizes people's Indigenous status. So their question really centered on that and what you guys think about this, the kind of the way that status has been restricted in past, and how it's been a challenge for people to actually be recognized and receive status. So I know that's a broad question, but I'm trying to.
Yeah, it is a broad question, and there's there's a lot of nuances and such, but essentially the Indian Act has got to go. The Indian Act is a vile instrument of control, and it saddens me that Canadians are still quite satisfied to have it. The fact that other people are telling us who's Indian and who isn't is outrageous. And the Indian Act is that's one of it. The Indian Act, I don't know if you guys have read Bob Joseph's book, 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. I recommend it. It's only a couple hundred pages. It's an easy read, and it's really, really a great eye opener, a great primer. And it truly, the Indian Act is behind that. The government of Canada should not take upon itself the right to decide who is an Indian and who is not. And the only reason why they're bothering to do that and keeping their hands on the wheel all the time, always keeping control of it, is because they want to reduce the number of Indigenous people. Canada signed treaties with us. And ever since then, the Indian Act has been their tool to get rid of their treaty partners. That's my thought about that. And it's become very complex. And the whole idea of assimilation, which Canada has been working on for more than 150 years now, is working very nicely. Thank you very much. And so you have people who, I think that it's natural that human beings are going to mix together and intermarry, and that's great. And that's just the nature of human beings, and that's all well and fine. But in terms of identifying who is Indigenous and who isn't, that should not be up to the government of Canada. It should be up to communities.
Yeah, absolutely. UNDRIP says the UNDRIP that they're promoting now, that they're going to follow, actually says that the children should be able to, assume the identity of their families. And just to add to what my good friend is saying, the last count I took, there's 6'2" Indians, 6'1" Indians, non-status Indians, treaty status Indians, status Indians, non-status Indians, and then there's like 8 or 9 different qualifications of what an Indian is in Canada today. Can you imagine if there was 8 or 9 different qualifications of what a Canadian was? And for me, if I could just add this, Betty, it is reconciliation. Actually, when we talk about it, it is a mockery. And I'll give you an example why. My daughter is the chief of Long Plains First Nation, and I'm very proud of that. First woman in 43 years. And yet, her daughter, Paige, my granddaughter, cannot get her status because of me and her dad. Indian chief and her daughter can't get registered. How does that make any sense? And yet, not to sound racial or anything, there are over 9,000 non-Indigenous women in Canada that have Indian status. They've got their Indian status cards. And my granddaughter, who has status Indians throughout on her maternal side, all of them are treaty Indians, cannot get status.
And
it's ridiculous.
Exactly. It's the reason why it's one of the many reasons why the Indian Act is a vile document that needs to go. And I think that people involved with policy need to look at the Indian Act and learn about it and understand what its purpose is, and work with Indigenous people to find a way to get rid of it, because it's this thing is like a tumor with tentacles that go through all the organs of the organism. Like how we cut out the Indian Act without it's going to be really, really, really hard. But policy advisor, and that's why policymakers haven't changed it, because it's not a simple thing, but it needs to be changed, and it just can't go on and on.
Yeah. So it's 7:51. My friend, my sister, I wanted to. There's a couple comments from Brenda Edel. Thank you for sharing your story. How humbling! I'm grateful to have learned your firsthand story. I'm grateful to hear your story. I'm so sorry that people treated you so badly. Thank you, Brenda. There's two questions. One from Emma. I'll ask her question first, but I wanted to ask you, Betty, after you answer Emma's question, could you expand on what is actually happening right now, currently, with the 60 Scoop agreement and how it's impacting people still? If you could do that. The question from Emma is: I've heard the argument that the Indian Act should be reformed because while it's a deeply racist document, deeply racist, it does not outline. It does outline important rights and roles for the feds and Indigenous folks. Not saying this is my view, but wondering what you would say to that argument. You want to answer that question, sister?
Well, I feel as though I sort of have answered it already. It's that absolute, there's just too much there to unpack, but it's like I say, like this is like, there are tentacles that go throughout Indigenous life because the Indian Act controls Indian life from the cradle to the grave. It affects every aspect of our lives and every aspect of our social being and our economic and our role in the economy. Everything is controlled by the Indian Act. They did everything they could to control every bit of Indigenous life. And Indigenous people have found ways to participate in the economy despite the Indian Act. And so absolutely, it takes people of goodwill, and it takes people beyond the politicians to make these changes, because the kinds of changes that are needed are going to take longer than a 4-year political cycle. We need, and I think of Rhett Sangster over at the Office of the Treaty Commissioner, who is, working on reconciliation groups across Saskatchewan, and his work as an ambassador, like when he was working with the Foreign Service, he knew from the beginning that you have to work outside of government with people who have influence in their spheres, and you develop those long-term relationships and build allies and relationships, and those groups who have voices beyond Indigenous people also bring their power and bring that elevate the voices of Indigenous people and their needs and their aspirations, and bring those to governments, so that whatever government is there, the government hopefully will work with them. But if they're unelected and someone else moves in, you've still got that basic structure of organizations and civil society who are working toward the greater aspirations.
Sorry, just a couple things from Lisa. Would there be a link to the documentary that Betty mentioned at the beginning? Such an insightful speaker and discussion. So maybe we can share that link. There it is, Birth of a Family.
This is a poster from the film. That's a picture of my mother. She was on the beach in Vancouver one time, and there was one of those artists on the beach who you could pay them $10 and they'd make your portrait. And she gave that to me. Anyway, so yeah, Birth of a Family was, it's on the National Film Board of Canada site. Just Google Birth of a Family NFB and it's right there and it's free. You can look at it. And so that's there. Yeah, and I would invite you as well if you're interested in Everything is Connected, which the 60 Scoop Society that Robert was one of the founding chair people of our society. We in recent years we've got some federal dollars to look at the connection between the 60 Scoop and the MMIW, and the film that we made is called Everything is Connected, and you can Google everythingisconnected.ca and it has its own little website, and the film is free to view there as well. And I'll warn you, it's a hard view. It's but it's I think it's enlightening.
Yes. There is one final question, but I got to say, I don't think we're going to get to this question. And the question was, from what I understand, the law, the Marry II Acts fought for made it so women no longer lose status when marrying non-Indigenous men. But does that also mean non-Indigenous women who married Indigenous men still maintain their status? And do they still maintain the status after the divorce? Yes, they do.
And
So
the
I'll
whole
just answer that question.
Yeah, and that whole change is still they've been tinkering with that to try to make it less sexist, but it's still, the problems persist, and there are still many people who they say they were enfranchised, right? They used to have this nice word that enfranchise the people, but what they really meant was stripping people of their Indigenous identity. Like, you stop being an Indian, now you're enfranchised, and which is really a perversion of a word. Yeah. So the Indian Act always intended to enfranchise the people, and even though they tinker with that sexist rule, it's still not perfect by any means, and there are many people who should be Indigenous, who should be able to claim their indigeneity and their status as treaty partners in this country, and who cannot, because the Indian Act still is still controlling it. And
there's also such a huge wait list to go through the paperwork. Like, I know people who've been waiting for like years after filing for status to get that approved. So there's a lot of barriers.
And so they're not funding it, right? I mean, so the government isn't staffing the department well enough to do it, right? If they wanted to increase the staff at Indian Affairs, they could do it. The government can come up with money for anything they need to. They can buy pipelines if they need to. They'll find the money. But when it comes to dealing with these things that Indigenous people need, somehow the money just can't afford it. So Canadians need to be aware that this is what their governments are doing in their name. As a Canadian, the government does this in your name. The government of Canada still has the Indian Act. It's your law. It's our law. And we as Canadians have not insisted that our governments change it.
Mm-hmm. And as Indigenous Canadians, keep paying your taxes.
You do.
Yes.
I want to thank you so much. Yeah, I just want to thank you so much for coming. This was amazing. I think everyone had some viewing and reading to catch up on. So thank you so much for being our speaker. And thank you everyone for coming. Our next session is next week, which is on duty to consult, which is another huge and very important issue. So folks can register for that. And just once again, huge thank you. That was like a great talk. And thank you so much for sharing with us. I know I was not the only one that was tearing up at your words. So just thank you so much. And Robert, any last words? Also, you, Betty, any last words?
Madam President, yes, just I wanted to make about 3 announcements really quickly. This is for people. This is there is a Building to Win tour going across Saskatchewan with Carla Beck. July 8th, Main Street, Moose Jaw. She's going to be at the Lemon Haven booth where Carla Beck, our NDP leader, will be serving freshly squeezed lemonade. On July 9th, the CUPE barbecue at the Kinsman Park from 11:30 to 1:30. I encourage everybody, that's this weekend, so get some free hot dogs and hamburgers. And July 24th, the 60th anniversary of Medicare. There's a free barbecue, speakers, music, and children activities, and that is at Buena Vista Park. And again, my beautiful sister and such a powerful person, thank you for being part of this. I'm a better person for knowing you. I just want to say that.
Okay, thanks a lot. It was good to be here.
Thank you. And that's our evening, everyone.
Yep.
Siguli Swagwag, Galakindi Neo Gets, Wagisli Wagini Wakitaloda. Again, my name is Galakindi, and I'm a member of the people of the Standing Stone First Nations of the Thames. I wanted to pop in because I had actually forgotten about this this Zoom meeting tonight until I got an email reminder, and so I thought I better jump on and get this shared. So I'll keep that VOD up for anyone who's interested in hearing her. If you didn't catch all of it, you can just watch the VOD and catch the rest of what she said right from the beginning. And so the other thing I was trying to do is I had gotten a message from the LG Music. And the LG Music is someone who has partaken in the Peaceful Warrior Project. So those of you who don't know what that is, I'll give you a little blurb there. What I like to do is I see that he is actually still alive. I'd like to pop over and hopefully you guys will all come with me. So if you first of all, I will put in the raid call. So if you can first of all just copy a raid call, and then refresh your screen just so that you are counted when we go over, and perhaps if we're not too late, maybe we'll hear his rendition of the Peaceful Warrior. He said he was going to perform it on his stream tonight live for the very first time that he's done this. So that would be awesome if we can get over there in time to see if we can get him to play it. In the meantime, I'll put in the I'll start that raid. So again, copy the raid call. I will be back on Friday. Friday night is our music night, so it'll be all about the sharing Indigenous music, and hopefully, if you want to start your weekend right, kick up your feet, just relax and enjoy some tunes. Friday's the time to be here, and you can also make requests. So if there are some Indigenous artists that you'd like to see, I would suggest, if you can, also jump into Discord and post your suggestions in the Discord, just to make sure that I have them before Friday. Because once I start the stream, I'm not able to really grab new ones if they're not already in my database. So just an idea. So let's go over and see the LG Music and see if we can hear how he's doing and show some support. And I appreciate again everyone being here. Love the support, and I'm so grateful. And I will see you all for Friday.
By the way, for Carly's wedding, you missed it earlier. Island Vibing was here, and now Vibing was here, and now the islands are involved in it. It's gonna be fun. Oh my God, Dark Native! Hey, Dark Native! I just played the Peaceful Warrior not too long ago. How's it going, Dark Native? Yes. Oh, cool. Oh, sweet. You're focusing on applying for a new home. Nice. Perfect. Dark Native, it's so great to see you. I'm actually about to play my last song, but let's see. Would you guys mind if I did the Peaceful Warrior again? Would everybody be okay with that? I know it's kind of long, but it's a really, really great song, and I really want to play it for Dark Native. If you guys are okay with that, I played it like half an hour ago. But guys, go follow Dark Native, an incredible streamer on Twitch. Wrote this poem called The Peaceful Warrior, and has asked a few streamers to kind of come with their own rendition of it. So I'm gonna do it for you guys. I had told Dark Native earlier that I really wanted to play it today,